Good morning, harvesters. Can you hear me? Well, I was originally scheduled to speak in November, but due to popular demand, I got moved up ahead. So I will be talking about week 3 today. I've already covered week 1 and 2. And today we're going to be talking about the body image and shroud history. So prior, in end of week 2, I had argued that the shroud is not a medieval fake, but it is from the 1st century and was used to wrap a crucified person that died. But I never argued why it's Jesus of Nazareth. So I'm going to briefly talk about that. And we see that it is Jesus of Nazareth because the features of the shroud match only one person in human history that has been crucified, that has been scourged, that has a side wound, facial wounds, crown of thorns, no broken bones, and buried in a fine linen cloth. And the Shroud of Turin has all these features that depicts Jesus of Nazareth. So at this point, I've argued that the Shroud of Turin is not a medieval fake. It's not a painting. It is from 1st century, and it is Jesus of Nazareth. But how can we determine Jesus was resurrected from the dead? Does the shroud show that? And I'm going to argue this morning that I believe it does, through how the image was created. So since the shroud wrapped Jesus, and it's not artwork of any kind, there must be some sort of non-artistic method that was used for the image of Jesus to get on that cloth. And there are several theories proposed, and we're going to look at some of those theories, and I'm going to argue which one I believe is the best theory. So we've covered a lot of the scientific features of the shroud, and we're going to have to match that to the theories. So I'm going to select some of the features that I presented in that first week. The first is the photographic negative effect. And the one on the left is what you would see with your naked eyes if you saw the shroud. But if you took a picture of it and then inverted it, that's what you would see on the right. Also said that there's depth encoding information on it. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about this. So you can see here his face, and then his body, and then his arms. And it looks like almost like a topographical rendition of Jesus' face and his chest and his body. So all this is from a 2-dimensional picture, which is very interesting because this is the only 2-dimensional picture that encodes 3-dimensional information. And the question is, why is that? Why does this shroud is able to encode 3-dimensional information? And I'm just going to hopefully try to explain this to you. The reason is because the areas that are darker is closer to the cloth. So we see this in the facial areas, the hair, chest, the arms. They're darker near the center. And so it is closer to the cloth. As you go away and towards the edge of the body, it gets fainter and fainter. And we see this throughout all parts of the body. And so as it gets fainter, then it is further away from the cloth. And they confirmed this through the VP8 image analyzer in 1976. But they also theorized this earlier, much earlier, after they took the first photograph, and then also when they took the second photograph in the 30s. And they did some crude experiments, and they were able to sort of determine that, yeah, there's encoded information, but it was really through the VP8 that we were able to see this pictorially. Again, there's nothing that's been added to the cloth to make the image. So there's no paint, dye, pigment, or any medium. The discoloration is only from the dehydration and oxidation of the fibers. And it is only on the topmost fibers of a yarn. So here we see the warp yarn, a warp yarn, and then the weft yarn, and only the top 1, 2, 3 fibers of a 200 fiber yarn has been discolored. It's not all of the fibers inside of a yarn that has been discolored. And only the surface of a fiber is discolored. So on the inside of a fiber, it is not colored. Also mentioned about the halftone effect, and that is when a picture is just comprised of dots. As you get closer to the image, the only thing you see is dots, and then the same thing with the shroud. This is a close-up of the nose, and you can't really tell that until you get farther away. I had mentioned about angle encoding, and angle encoding is not something that is found. I just made up that term in order to describe this effect. But what I'm trying to convey is that there's certain things that are at the angle of the body, like the sides of the body, that are either less showed up or doesn't even show up at all. Like, for example, there are no ears on the shroud. And this is the front top of the head, and this is the back, and there is nothing in between. Now, if the shroud was covered around here like this, it was touching the head, but there is no imaging at the top of the head. So you have to account for that. Whatever theory that you propose has to explain this as well. And same with the hands. Here's the hands right here, and there is no thumb. Now, there are some theories as to why the thumbs are not shown. Some theorize it's because a nail was placed through the wrist, and then it ruptured the median nerve, and then it collapsed the thumb. That could be one aspect, but I think another aspect to it is this angle encoding. With the hands, we also see sort of like an X-ray effect. We see the metacarpal and the finger bones of the hand. And also we see this in the teeth over here. And I believe this is the teeth that we observe. And the X-ray effect only goes down several millimeters deep from the surface. It is not as though we see through the entire head like a typical X-ray. So the theory has to account for why the X-ray effect is only piercing down a few millimeters. The image is hyperrealistic, so it is not like someone who just drew this or painted it. It looks anatomically perfect. We talked about the side strip. There's about 3.5 inch wide strip that is along the left side over here, and it has been reattached through a seam like this, which is a seam that is found in Masada. There is no breakage or smearing of the blood. There is no decomposition. So whatever theory that we propose, the best theory would align with the most of these features. So if you have a body and you have a cloth, we have to think about how can the image of the body get onto the cloth? And there's two ways. Either the information from the body was transmitted to the cloth. So for example, maybe a gas was emitted from the body, and then it came from the body, and then it somehow discolored the cloth. Or light reflected off the body or emitted from the body, and then it landed on the cloth. Or some sort of radiation or neutrons or something came from the body, and then it came on the cloth. Does that make sense? Now, there's actually another way, is for the opposite direction, for the cloth to go onto the body. And that's a little bit harder to understand because that doesn't really happen in real life. But it's just the backwards, just reverse direction. So it's either the information came from the body to the cloth or the cloth went to the body. So those are the only two mechanisms that we can transfer information from the body to the cloth. So the top non-artistic body image formation theories, the Maillard reaction, which is the vapor, neutron radiation, corona discharge, and the cloth collapse. And I'm going to be going through all of these. So the Maillard reaction was proposed by Ray Rogers. He was the lead chemist on STIRP. And it's a chemical reaction between the amino acids and sugars. And we see this in the browning of foods, steaks, fried dumplings, and cookies. This is all the Maillard reaction. And so what Ray Rogers is proposing is that some sort of like ammonia gas came off from the body as it died, and then it was reacted to some sugars that was on the cloth itself. But there's some issues with the Maillard reaction. One is, if a gas is coming off a body, how can it produce a high definition image? Gas would just be radiating, and you're not going to see a perfect image. You're just going to see a big blob, really. But we don't see that. We see a hyper-realistic image. And how would it encode a depth information with that? Now, you might be able to sort of, if it was a far distance away. So like, if it was very far, you would get little gas. And then if it was very close, you would get more gas. But this is only on the millimeters, centimeters away. And so how can there be that much gas difference for that short of a distance? The head gap. So as I mentioned, the cloth was surrounding the head. And so how can gas account for that lack of imaging at the head gap? The angle encoding, we see no ears and no thumbs. How can that explain that? There's no decomposition. So as ammonia gas is coming from the body, eventually it's going to fully decompose, but we don't see any evidence of decomposition on the shroud. The blood stains are intact. So maybe someone can theorize, well, he partially was decomposing and then someone took the body out. But that is countered by the fact that the blood stains are intact. So no one could have actually removed the body prior to full decomposition. And there is uniform imaging on the ventral and the dorsal sides. So how would the gas uniformly go up and down to produce a uniform image? The neutron radiation theory is proposed by Robert Rucker. And he proposes neutron radiation was emitted from the body. And it was emitted straight up and down from the body. It's vertically collimated radiation. And so this is the same thing as the gas. The radiation cannot be going out like a light bulb, let's say, because it would just go out in all directions. It's not going to form a perfectly uniform image. And so that's why Robert Rucker has to propose vertically collimated radiation. It is more like this laser right here. It would be going straight up and straight down. This radiation that's coming out from the body would be going straight up and straight down, parallel to gravity. He primarily proposed this to explain why the carbon-14 dating was off. Because the way that carbon-14 works is through neutrons hitting nitrogen, and then that forms carbon-14. So he primarily proposed this to explain why we have a medieval date with the 1988 carbon-14. He modified it over the years to also account for the image formation. The corona discharge is proposed by Giulio Fanti. And it's similar to the neutron radiation, except he uses corona discharge. And you see the corona discharge around power transmission lines. And so the heat from the corona discharge discolored the linoleum fibers. In the same way, he proposes there was some sort of linear path that the corona discharge did, unlike typical corona discharge. So the issues with the radiation theories, the corona discharge and the neutron radiation, is this ad hoc nature of the vertically collimated radiation. Now, it could happen, but you just have to add this additional proposal. And so, using Occam's razor, hopefully you would prefer the one that is less ad hoc. It also does not explain the cloth-to-body distance encoding. So if you have a light that's being emitted, whether this laser light or that light itself, you cannot, just by looking at the light, determine the distance. So you at least need 2 light sources to triangulate that. But just from one single laser, there's no way to really tell the distance just from that single laser. It also does not explain why is only the top surface of the teeth encoded on it instead of the entire head that's encoded in X-ray. So the cloth collapse theory was proposed by John Jackson, who was the head of STIRP. And so what he proposes is the body was wrapped in the shroud, and that side strip that I talked about was used to wind around the body and to hold the cloth in place. And then what happened after that, while the body was rigor mortis and before decomposition, the body dematerialized. And when the body dematerialized, when the body disappeared, it would form a vacuum within that shroud. And then because of that vacuum, the cloth would collapse on itself through the body. The top part would collapse down, and the bottom part would collapse up to fill up that vacuum. And so that is how the cloth was going to the body instead of the radiation from the body going to the cloth. So this is not intuitive because this doesn't happen in everyday life. So does this sort of make sense, what I'm proposing? Kind of, okay. We'll have time for Q&A later. But I do realize this is not an intuitive concept, but just think about it as maybe like a bag of potato chips. You got potato chips inside, and then the potato chips got teleported out, and then all the air inside got teleported out too, and then because of that, there's a vacuum in it, and it just collapsed flat. So it's sort of like the same thing. So during the fraction of a second while the body was dematerializing, the cloth would interact with the dematerializing body, and it would form the image on the cloth. So it explains all these features of the shroud, the photonegative effect. So the cloth is yellow, whitish, and as the cloth was interacting with the body, it oxidized, and then so the parts that oxidized is the parts that touched the body, and then it turned darker. Now, the parts that were closer to the body, it interacted with the cloth more. The cloth that was farther away, it interacted with the body less. So that's why there's this change in the discoloration, and that would account for the depth encoding. It also accounts for the angle encoding, because as the shroud, suppose the body is here and then the shroud was like this, the cloth would collapse down. And then the parts that are the side, it would not collapse as much. And so there was less imaging on the sides. And there'd be more imaging at the top because it was flat that's going down. At the sides, it's just going down like this. And so there's less cloth that is interacting with the body. It explains the X-ray effect and also on the first few millimeters because the cloth did not go through the entire body during the dematerialization process. It was only a fraction of a second that it was able to capture that because the whole process occurred very quickly. It explains hyperrealism. We talked about the side strip. There's no breakage of the bloodstains because the body dematerialized. And there's no decomposition because the body dematerialized before it got to the stage of decomposition. So out of all these four theories, I believe the cloth collapse theory best explains the features of the shroud. Now, I will add that it could be possible that neutron radiation was also involved, but I think we can add that without having to add this vertically collimated radiation. So in John 28, it says, "Then went in also the other disciple, which came first to the sepulchre, and he saw and believed." So what did the disciple see, and why did he believe, and what did he believe? This is what I believe he saw, and this is what I saw, and this is why he believed. It's because when the disciple came to the tomb, he looked inside, he saw the linen clothes, the main shroud, and the side strip wound around it. And what he saw looked like the body had simply vanished from within the shroud. It did not look like someone had unwrapped the side strip and opened the shroud. And because he saw that, he says, well, the only way to explain that is the body has simply disappeared. It's as if you took a bag of potato chips, it's not even opened, and there's no chips inside. Automatically, you would think someone teleported all those chips away from it, right? And so he was the first to see this, and he believed in the resurrection. This is what I believe that he believed. So at this point, the shroud, I've argued that the shroud is not medieval. The shroud wraps Jesus of Nazareth, and that through this imaging mechanism of the cloth collapse, it shows that he was resurrected from the dead. And when the disciples came in 33 AD, the beloved disciple saw and believed. Now, one question that has come up is, okay, well, do we have any evidence of the shroud in existence from 33 AD to 1578? 1578 is when the shroud actually entered the Turin Cathedral. So I'm going to talk about this. I also want to add that this is a theory, and I do not use any of this as evidence for the authenticity of the shroud because this is highly disputed. There's many, many theories on the path of the shroud, but I believe this is a plausible path. And most of this came from Ian Wilson. So again, I am not claiming that any of this points to the authenticity. And the reason I say that is because some of the shroud proponents actually use historical evidence as arguments for the authenticity, but I do not. Okay, so the shroud would have started in Jerusalem, 33 AD, and then gone to Edessa. And in 544, Edessa fell to the Persians. And then in 944, Constantinople reclaimed the shroud from Edessa, but they lost the shroud in 1204 during the fall of Constantinople. And then it traveled to Liri in 1356, around that area, around that time. We don't know exactly when it went over there, but we do know that it existed in Liri, France in 1356. And then it went to Chambéry. There was a fire there in Chambéry. And then finally it arrived in Turin. So I'm going to quickly go through some of the evidence for this. So when the beloved disciple went into the tomb, the Bible doesn't make any mention about the disciples taking the shroud. However, in the Gospel of Hebrews, and it's a lost work, so we don't have any textual evidence of it except for secondhand accounts. And it's been quoted by some of the Alexandrian fathers, Clement, Origen, and Didymus, and Jerome. And in the Gospel of the Hebrews, it says, "And when the Lord had given the linen cloth to the servant of the priest, he went to James and appeared to him." So this is one of the earliest textual evidences of this shroud in existence in the Gospel of the Hebrews.
What chapter and verse is that? Do you know?
So we don't have that in existence. So this is only quoted by other sources. So maybe, hopefully someone can dig it up sometime and find it. But at this point, we don't have that. Now there's another legend about King Abgar, and here's a picture of King Abgar. This is on an Armenian banknote. And he was one of the first Christian kings in history. He lived 1st century BCE to AD 50, and he was converted by Thaddeus, one of the 70 disciples. And the legend is that he got healed by the shroud. And this was the Abgar legend. Now, it's just a legend, so we don't know if it's true or false, but there's probably some truth to it. The image of Edessa is something that art historians, they all accept in existence, but it is claimed by Ian Wilson that the image of Edessa and the Shroud of Turin is the same thing. And some dispute that, but I think it's pretty convincing that it's similar. Actually, the same thing. It was also known as the Mandylion, and also known as the Acaria Poeta, which is Greek for "not made by hand." So all of these items, the image of Edessa, Mandylion, Acaria Poeta, Ian Wilson theorizes that all of these are referring to the Shroud of Turin. Now, obviously, before it was in Turin, it was not called the Shroud of Turin. So it was called something else. So you have to try to do some detective work about, well, what was it called before? After King Abgar, the Edessa reverted to paganism, and it's theorized that the shroud was hidden in a jar and stored in the city wall in Edessa, and that was there for several hundred years. And then it was rediscovered in 525. And what's interesting about that is after that time, the images of Jesus on artwork started to all become very, very similar. And you have to explain, why is that? Why is all artwork of Jesus after that time pretty much all look the same? And this accounts for that, because the shroud emerged at that time. In 544, Edessa was attacked by the Persians and captured, and was so no longer in possession by the Christians. But I find this very interesting, because during the periods of 726 to 787 and 800s was the Byzantine iconoclasm. And during those times, the Byzantines destroyed a lot of their artwork. And so coincidentally, this shroud was in pagan hands while the Christians were destroying all of their icons. I find that to be very interesting. In 943, the Byzantines negotiates with Edessa for the shroud, and they were able to reclaim it. And that happened to be after all of the iconoclasm. In the Fourth Crusade, in 1204, Constantinople was sacked. This is very interesting too. I really didn't study much about the Fourth Crusade, but they should make a Netflix series on this. This is so fascinating. Because why would a Christian pilgrims attack another Christian city? And there's a very interesting story behind that. So they sacked it, and they took all their stuff, all their money, all their relics, and they took it back to Europe. And so it's theorized a French crusader, probably a Templar, took the shroud back to France. On Friday, October 13, 1307, the French Templars were arrested by King Philip. And one theory as to why we don't like Friday the 13th is probably because it originated from this. And on 1310, 54 Templars were burned at the stake. And then in 1314, the Grand Master Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charnay were burned at the stake. Now, in 1355, there is a different Geoffrey de Charnay who owned the shroud, and he built a church in Liry, France. Now, we don't know the connection between the Geoffrey de Charnay that was a Templar and the Geoffrey de Charnay that owned the shroud, but I just tend to suspect there's some sort of correlation there. I don't think it's more like a relative, but I think there's some correlation. Now, his son, Geoffrey II, displayed the shroud in the Liry church and started selling souvenirs of it around the late 1350s. Oh, and at this point, with the Geoffrey de Charnay, at this point, even the skeptics acknowledge, okay, this is historical. So it's pretty much before that the skeptics seriously dispute the historical trail. In 1453, Margaret de Charnay, one of the relatives, descendants of Geoffrey de Charnay, sold the shroud to the House of Savoy in exchange for estate revenues and a castle. And the reason I show this is because they obviously thought that the shroud was very valuable. And so for a knight in a small city of Liry to be able to acquire this, let's say that he bought it, I don't think that's really feasible, because I don't think he would have had that much money in order to buy it. And why would he show it in a small church in Liry? It was just a wooden church. That church doesn't even exist anymore. And so why would he show it in such a small church? In 1502, the shroud was housed in Chambéry. In 1532, there was a fire there. And we see all the major fire burns here. These major fire burns here are from that fire in 1532. And then in 1578, the shroud is moved to Turin, and where it resides to this day. So that is a week 3. In our final week, we will cover scripture related to the shroud and what is the relevance of the shroud to us. So we have some time, and I will open it up for questions, and we don't have a whole lot of time, so if you can keep your questions to less than a minute so we can get to everybody.
Oh, gee, look, I happen to have a microphone. Is gassing, radiation, chemical emission, is that common? I mean, when other people die, does that happen?
Gassing. Yes. There's actually some images of people who have died in their bed sheets, and the body's been there for a long time, and then the body's decomposed, and then you can see basically just a big stain. It's not a clear image of the image of the body, but it's just a big stain. So we do have gases, fluids coming out of the body, staining the cloth.
In the scripture account, they describe the fact that when the other disciples got to the tomb, that the linen cloths had been folded neatly and set aside. How do you correlate that to what you were talking about with John's vision, what he saw?
Yeah. Actually, the way that I read the Bible is it was the headcloth that was folded neatly. It was not the shroud. So that's very interesting. And so the headcloth, the sudarium, that was the headcloth. That was the cloth that covered the head, and that was used, I believe, during the transport from when Jesus was on the cross to the tomb itself. There's a couple of purposes for that. One is for modesty, because he was just so severely disfigured. They just wanted to cover the head. Also, they wanted to save all of the blood. So the Jewish tradition is they want to save all the blood, and they even do that to this day, so that all of the blood can be buried with the body. So the sudarium was covered over his head when he was taken off the cross, and while they were transporting Jesus to the tomb, he had the sudarium on. When he was in the tomb, Joseph of Arimathea took the sudarium off, folded it, placed it to the side. Then he put the body of Jesus on the shroud and placed him there, and then put the cloth over him. Before that, he was in this state of rigor mortis, and so his arms were like this. And so they had to break the rigor mortis for the arms to come down like this, and then place them on the cloth. And I think this is all conjecture. This is just my own personal theory. But when he broke the rigor mortis, the arms were just sagging like this, and he wanted to put it like this. And so he decided at that point to cut the side strip, that 3-inch side strip. So I believe that side strip was cut after Jesus was placed on the cloth, because the reason I say this is if you look at the image of the Shroud of Turin, the body is centered on the entire cloth. It is, and then including the side strip. So that means that the body was placed on the cloth centered, including the side strip. And then after the fact, he decided to cut off the side strip. And also this side strip is not a uniform cut. And so it sort of like has various widths as he's cutting it. So it was not done very cleanly. So that's another evidence, I believe, that it was cut after he was laid down. And then that side strip was used to bind the body and to hold everything in place.
over there.
Oh, over there, okay.
Oliver, closer. The custody of the shroud, I think, is very important, and it was helpful to have that up there. One of the things you mentioned was Egbar, which is the
Egbar,
beginning
yeah.
of your slide. I believe his queen, Helena, became Jewish and lived in Judah in 44, 46, somewhere in that point in time, and during the famine gave food to Israel, gave a contribution to buy food for all of Judah because of the famine. And she was a very devout Jew, so I think that might be another possible link of how the shroud got all the way out to Egmar. That's in Josephus.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's good, that's good. Yeah, I haven't heard of that, that's good.
The microphone's here. I'll
Okay.
come up there in just a second.
Hey, you mentioned, excuse me, a vacuum. Is there evidence that essentially the mummification process of wrapping bodies would be tight enough to create a vacuum?
Okay. A point of clarification, it wasn't a mummification process, so he wasn't mummified, but it was sort of wrapped, sort of looked like a mummy, but it wasn't a mummification process. So that's a good question. So I wouldn't say it's airtight in terms of the cloth and then the wrapping, but if all of that air and all of the body just simply disappeared, there would have been some sort of vacuum in that process. And then so there would have been collapse of the cloth. Now, I'm going to go a little bit beyond that and say, I also believe it was sort of like a controlled collapse, controlled dematerialization. So, because what I mean is, it was sort of controlled so that the cloth was going on down like this, up and down like this, so that it wouldn't have been collapsing as much with the sides. So if it just instantly disappeared, the entire body instantly disappeared in a single moment, then maybe it was just crumpled up, all together like this. But I believe that it was more like a controlled dematerialization, where the cloth was collapsing in a plane fashion like this.
You answered part of it, but it's hard for me to see how you can put a vacuum on a porous media and collapse it like that. Another thing is that rigor mortis normally takes 24 hours or more before it starts to set in. And didn't the ladies come in and anoint him with various types of chemicals, oils, and things like that might have stained this?
Okay. So Mary and the other women came in after the Sabbath. But the Bible does not say that they did anything at that time. So they did come, but it doesn't say anything about if they actually did anything. You're talking about the porous nature of the cloth?
Yeah.
So, yeah, so it would still have to collapse anyways, because if there was a vacuum there, so I don't believe the air would have been able to go through the cloth fast enough so that it didn't collapse. So I think, yeah, there would have been some sort of collapse method.
To combine the last 2 points, to me, in my image, we don't know exactly how the collapse occurred, but it would seem to me like you're just talking about burning something on a cloth. There had to be maybe some kind of energy emitted in this dematerialization, because that would have imprinted the image right permanently on the cloth. And then the rest of it would account, whether it's slow or fast or whatever.
Yeah.
Then after that collapse occurred, it would account for the coarse nature of the cloth also.
Yes, yeah. And also, this theory doesn't fully account for everything. And there's probably some sort of combination of all these things involved. And so that's why I don't really totally discount the neutron radiation either. Because that's probably involved, maybe even the corona discharge is somehow involved as well. So there's maybe a combination of all of these things. But one thing I do like about the cloth collapse is that it accounts for all of these different features.
There was and I read this, so it just really touched my heart. But about the two, there's a Jewish tradition that when one is at the table and must get up and leave, but they're coming back, that they would take their napkin, maybe which did a whole lot of more than just cover their protect their lap, but they take their napkin and they would fold it and put it in their place. And that was a sign that they were coming back. If they were not coming back, they just throw it down on the table and leave it. And we find that, yes, when they enter, which gospel it is, I don't remember, but that the face cloth was folded beautifully and laid down on top. The rest we don't, it doesn't say, but the face cloth was folded. And I think that's beautiful. It was a sign to them, those Jewish people, that Jesus is coming back.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. I've never heard that.
Regarding the cloth theory, when I see the image as it's projected up there, it seems as though, in a transverse way across it, that the image is pretty much uniform all the way across, so from side to side. So that would, to me, suggest that the cloth was wrapped tautly, because normally you think of wrapping cloth is going to have some irregularities, maybe a fold in it. So if a 3-inch strip was used to, let's say, tighten it, is there any evidence that there's some crinkling there that would create some differentiation in that? And then also, to the degree that there was a fire later, how was perhaps smoke introduced into the cloth, and was that measured? And then thirdly, in the head area where the crown is there any evidence of blood, and let's say in that area of the cloth as well?
Oh yeah, I'll answer those in reverse order. There is evidence of blood everywhere on the head, especially in the back. So it's definitely not like the laurel that's depicted in a lot of artwork, but it's more like a cap of blood stains all around the head. There are actually what I would call second-degree distortions that I believe the cloth collapse theory accounts for. So a lot of the skeptics say, well, his proportions of his face are all wrong. His forehead's too big, or his fingers are too long, or things like that. I believe the cloth collapse theory explains that because of the projection technique that's involved with this. So, like making a map, there's many ways to make a projection of a 3-dimensional Earth onto a 2-dimensional plane. So there's many different types of maps. So it all depends on the projection method that's used. So this projection method of the cloth collapse, I believe, accounts for those second-degree distortions, like the long head and the long fingers and things like that.
And the smoke?
Oh, and the smoke. Smoke could have been involved with it as well. And some people theorize that that influenced the carbon-14 dating. It might have, but I like Sue Benford and Joe Marino's theory of the invisible reweave, which accounts for a lot of the different problems. And I've also brought the evidence with Ray Rogers detecting cotton in the sample of the carbon-14. So smoke could have been involved, but it's not a widely favored view of explaining the 1988 carbon-14 dating.
Oliver, how long in your studies did you find that the body was in the shroud?
How long?
How many hours?
Oh, how many hours? 3 days and 3 nights, before he got resurrected. Now, when we say 3 days and 3 nights, that's not literal 24 times 3. So 3 days and 3 nights meant, okay, part of a day. So Friday night, Saturday, Sunday. So that would be considered 3 days and 3 nights.
Oliver, as far as tracking where the shroud was, my recollection is there was some evidence in the study about traces of pollen showing that it was in those locations at various times.
Yeah.
Could you speak to that?
Yeah, good observation. Notice in my past 3 weeks, I never even talked about the pollen. I never even talked about the coins. So I've been intentional in that because those are disputed by the Shroud skeptics. And so I've decided to not include that because it's disputable evidence. Some people claim it's good evidence, but I've decided not to use any evidence that the skeptics will say, okay, that's not good evidence. But I do believe there was pollen there. Max Fry is the one who did the pollen research, and he was a pioneer in this field. And so the skeptics like to just make fun of him because of all these mistakes that he made. But come on, he was the first guy to do this. And so he can't figure out everything. So I give Max Fry a lot of credit, and I believe in his work, but I don't present that as evidence. All right, we have time for one more, and then we have to pass this off to the
One more.
next speaker.
Do you have it? Okay, I've got one over here.
Okay. Last one.
Man, we run a tight ship here, huh?
Otherwise, they're not going to bring me back to the 4th week.
So it occurs to me that so much of the evidence is based on science. And God is so much capable of things beyond our comprehension. So to what extent have theories been developed that explains the unexplainable?
I can't explain that.
And on that note,
We're going to end with that question?
come back for week 4.
Now, next week, I'm going to be talking about this all from a scriptural point of view, which I think is very, very interesting. Because the relevance of this to me is that it illuminates Scripture. And I'll just give you a teaser about this, is in the 4th week, it doesn't matter if you believe if it's a fake or real. It doesn't matter if you believe if it's authentic or it's actually a medieval fake. Because either way, it illuminates Scripture. And that is going to be very, very interesting. And that's what I'll be presenting in the 4th week.
Thank you, Oliver. Let's thank him for his presentation.